Lecture 21, Forms of Islam, Diversity Among Muslims.
As we have seen, a central concept in Islam is tawheed, unity. And there's certainly a sense that Muslims think of themselves as a worldwide community, an ummah. When Muslims meet other Muslims for the first time, they'll often refer to each other as brother and sister. They'll feel an immediate connection. At the same time, conflicts among Muslims have been occurring since the earliest period of the tradition, and Muslim-on-Muslim violence is occurring throughout the world at a disturbing rate today. What has caused the rifts within the Muslim community? Within every religious tradition, there are major divisions. And within Islam, the most significant division is between Sunnis and Shiites. This division has its origin in a dispute over who would succeed Muhammad as leader of the Muslim community after his death. The successor would be known as the Khalifa, Caliph, or Caliph in English, and would not be seen as a prophet, as Muhammad was the seal or last of the prophets. There were two primary positions on succession. One group believed that the successor should be chosen by consensus of Muhammad's closest companions, and this group favored one of Muhammad's most loyal companions, Abu Bakr. The other group believed that the successor should come from Muhammad's family line, namely his cousin and son-in-law, Ali. Ali, who was married to Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad and his first wife Khadija, had been one of Muhammad's first followers. When Abu Bakr became the caliph, many of the loyal supporters of Ali, known as Shia to Ali, or partisans of Ali, were unhappy. And this form of Islam became known as Shia, and its followers are often called Shiites in English. After the third caliph was assassinated, Ali became caliph in 656, but was murdered in 661, an event that left his supporters devastated. They continued to believe that Muhammad's direct descendants should have authority, and their hope now lay with Ali's son, Muhammad's grandson, Hussein. The caliph who took power at the time, Yazid, ordered 4,000 of his men to fight against Hussein. And Hussein had only 72 followers with him, yet he did not turn back. He went to fight, despite the fact that he must have known he wouldn't survive. The battle was fought in Karbala, in present-day Iraq, and Hussein and his followers, along with two of Hussein's sons, died. This event became a pivotal event in Shia history. Some of the major themes of the Shia narrative were established: the oppression of Shiites, the martyrdom of their leaders, and the need to fight injustice no matter what the cost. The martyrdom of Hussein at Karbala is reenacted in Shia communities throughout the world. In a sense, it's somewhat analogous to the Christian Passion Play, as the suffering and martyrdom of Hussein and his followers is recreated and kept alive in the consciousness of Shiites every year. It's a type of vivid religious theater, and the reenactment often involves men on horseback, the clashing of weapons, the explosion of firecrackers, blood, and a dramatic death scene. Because of the passion that it stirs up, Shiites were not allowed to take pilgrimages to Karbala under Saddam Hussein's rule, which was the rule by a Sunni minority in a Shia majority country. While the Sunni notion of Muhammad's successor was focused on the office of caliph, the Shia believed in a line of imams. The word imam has a different meaning in Shia Islam than the general use of imam that we discussed, which means a prayer leader in a mosque. For Shiites, imam refers to an authoritative religious leader, a charismatic figure who in some cases is understood to be a divinely inspired, infallible interpreter of God's will. So the difference between Sunni and Shia is not just about Muhammad's successor, but about the nature of leadership itself. Shia imams were far more than temporal leaders. Rather, they were direct bloodline descendants of Muhammad with significant religious authority. There are many branches of Shia, And the distinctions in these branches are primarily related to who they believe were the legitimate successors of Ali and Hussein. The most populous branch is known as the Twelvers. They recognize a line of 12 imams from the time of Ali and Hussein down to the 12th, who disappeared as a child. Twelver Shia believe that he is hidden in a place of what they call occultation and will return in the future to bring about a perfect Islamic society. This gives Twelver Shi'ism a strong messianic dimension. Because of this conception of leadership, Shia leaders tend to have greater authority than leaders in the Sunni world. Take the example of Iran, a country that is overwhelmingly populated by Twelver Shia Muslims. And it's the only country directly ruled by Shia clerics. Images of those 12 imams can be seen throughout Iran. There's a particularly strong emphasis on Ali and Hussein. The Ayatollahs are understood to be ruling in place of the absent 12th imam, who will one day return. Powerful leaders like the founder of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini, attain a status considered by many to be infallible. The word Ayatollah itself means sign of God, and Khomeini was often called Imam Khomeini by many followers, a title of great import. While the conflict over the succession of Muhammad and the different conceptions of authority explain much about the difference between Sunni and Shia, there's much more to it than that. Whatever the origins of a division, once it occurs, groups then acquire numerous grievances against each other, particularly by the minority against the majority. Sunnis make up 85% of the Muslim population, and the Shiites only 15%. And throughout history, there are many examples of Shiites being oppressed and persecuted by Sunni majorities in places like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Saudi Arabia. Much of the tension and suspicions between these two groups today comes from past mistreatment and grievances more than from theological or philosophical differences. Sufism is the mystical branch of Islam. As we know, mysticism can be a tricky word to define, but it points to the path that leads to a direct experience of ultimate reality, which here would mean a direct encounter with God. There are many rich traditions and schools within Sufism, but we can discern three primary streams: ascetic, contemplative, and devotional. As the Islamic Empire grew and gained more wealth and power, some rulers began to live in luxurious conditions, surrounding themselves with pleasure and riches. Sufis criticized such tendencies, and they sounded warnings about the dangers of worldly attachments. Their call to detach from material desires earned them the title darwish or dervish, meaning poor or mendicant. The word Sufi itself may come from the word suf, which refers to the coarse shirts of wool that some chose to wear. Sufi asceticism did not take the form of severe austerities or world-denying renunciation. Rather, it was an emphasis on simplicity, inwardness, and piety. This brings us to the second strain, the contemplative. Sufism employs a range of techniques to connect the seeker to God. Such techniques can include meditation, prayer, and chanting, as we'll see. And finally, there's the devotional strand, which is perhaps the most powerful. Sufism is known as a path of the heart, a path of love. Sufi poetry is filled with the language of love, as the mystic longs for God, as the lover longs for the beloved. Sufis are organized into orders, which are known as brotherhoods or sisterhoods. While these resemble religious orders and other traditions in some ways, they differ from most monastic orders. Most Sufis are not celibate, and they don't live with the order full time. They usually have jobs and families, as Islam has generally rejected celibacy and monasticism, unlike Buddhism and Christianity. The disciples are led by a master known as a sheikh in Arabic or a pir in Persian. The sheikh is considered a guide who teaches the disciples the path to God and can be seen as a channel through whom divine blessings flow. there's a deep connection between sheikh and disciple. This connection is often maintained after death, as shrines are built for the remains of Sufi saints, who are known as walis, friends of God. Sufis make pilgrimages to these shrines, and many believe that the saint's spiritual power can be felt at the shrine and can bring blessings to the pilgrims. Some conservative Muslims criticize this as a form of shirk, worshiping a being other than God. Sufis reply that they're not worshiping the saint, but rather they see the saint as a point of connection with God. I've been fortunate enough to visit Sufi shrines, and there's a great deal of devotion evident there. Pilgrims pay their respects at the tomb, making offerings of flower petals or silks, listening to the passionate sounds of qawwali singing, the music of Sufi devotionalism. Sufi brotherhoods engage in a range of activities, the most important being the rituals known as zikr, which means remembrance. These often involve rhythmic, repetitive chanting and recitation. These bring about a deep state of awareness of, or even absorption in, God. Sufis can chant the Shahada, for example, breathing rhythmically and turning their heads to the right and left each time they chant La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah. Sometimes they just chant the phrase Allahu, Allahu, meaning God, He. Some Sufi orders use music and stylized dance, which are forbidden during worship in many forms of more mainstream Islam. The most famous example of this is the dance of the Mevlevi order of Sufis known as the Whirling Dervishes. In this dance, which is usually accompanied by drumming and other instruments, such as flutes, the dancers, wearing white gowns and tall brown hats, spin around their sheikh, who's in the center. He's like the sun around whom the dervishes orbit. As they spin, their right hand opens toward the sky and the left hand points at the ground, connecting the divine with the realm of creation, heaven with earth. The dance, which can induce states of mystical consciousness through its extended spinning, represents a spiritual journey toward God. The ultimate goal of the Sufi is to get the ego or self out of the way so that they can fully experience union with God. Sheikh Hujwiri said, "The Sufi is absent from himself and present with God." The Sufi comes to see God everywhere, and a profound oneness and sense of unity of creation is experienced. We cannot leave our discussion of Sufism without an example of Sufi devotional poetry. The best-known composer of such poetry is Jalal ad-Din Rumi, a 13th century Sufi mystic. I encourage you to look at collections of Rumi's poetry, as it's powerful, passionate, and thought-provoking. Rumi often uses metaphors of intoxication and romantic love to capture the feeling of being completely consumed by the love of God. Many of the Sufi themes we've been discussing, such as the need to dissolve the boundaries around the self and the pursuit of an intimate, direct connection with God, can be found in his poems. For example, Rumi writes, "Lo, I am with you always," means that when you look for God, God is in the look of your eyes, nearer to you than yourself. There's no need to go outside. Be melting snow. Wash yourself of yourself. Some scholars talk about a clash of civilizations, as if there were a confrontation between Islam and the West. I would argue that there are clashes, but they're just as likely to occur within Islam, among Muslims, and within the West for that matter, as they are between Islam and Western values. Many fault lines within Islam have been present for centuries, but some have become deeper recently. When we left our story of the history of Islam, we saw the tradition grow into one of the greatest empires the world had ever known, with cities that represented the height of world civilization. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, we see a very different world. Almost every part of the Muslim world was colonized by European powers. The Middle East, South and Southeast Asia and Africa were dominated and carved up by England, France, and others. Muslims felt disempowered and humiliated. How would this happen to them? More importantly, what should be done in response? There have been a wide range of responses, but they tend to cluster in three categories. The first argued that the decline in the Muslim world is due to a departure from the straight path of Islam. Muslims had lost power because they had strayed from Islam. The answer, therefore, was to return to true Islam, to reject the West and reinvigorate the Islamic tradition. Doing so would return them to greatness. On the opposite side of the spectrum was the second response. Imitate the West. Focus on modernization through secularization and westernization. The third position posed a middle alternative. Modernize, but in an Islamic way. Show that Islamic revival would bring about the flourishing of science and democracy and would lead to modernization, but without secularization. This position, which we can call Islamic modernism, emerged largely during the 19th century and argued that the doors of ijtihad, the effort to interpret the sources of Islam in light of the current situation, had to be reopened. Islam would be the essence, but Western ideas and technology could be selectively adapted as long as they didn't conflict with Islam. Social equality, the sovereignty of the people, and science were not Western innovations, modernists argued, but they were actually part of the Islamic tradition all along. Autocratic rulers and ignorant or corrupt scholars neglected that tradition, but it could be recovered and revitalized. A radically different approach was seen in a movement that would come to dominate the land of Islam's birth and the location of its pilgrimage sites, Saudi Arabia. This is known as the Wahhabi movement, founded by Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab in the 18th century. He was drawn to the Hanbali school of law, a relatively strict and puritanical school. His approach was to purify Islam, weeding out those who deviated from true Islam. And he advocated rejecting the West completely. Wahhabis focus on doctrinal orthodoxy, and they condemn and often repress Shiites and Sufis. They advocate a literalist approach to interpretation and a strict application of the law. This movement might not have had much of an impact in the world were it not for the alliance that al-Wahhab made with the tribal chief Muhammad ibn Saud, whose descendants would come to rule what is now known as Saudi Arabia. Wahhabism became the official religious ideology of Saudi Arabia and, due to Saudi oil wealth, has been exported throughout the Muslim world. Now that we've seen examples of different movements within Islam that emerged in the early modern period, we can look at the landscape in the present day. You might see the media labeling a growing movement as Islamic fundamentalism. But that's a problematic term, as it originates with Christianity, and it doesn't precisely apply here. Members of this movement advocate a return to Islam and argue that because the sovereignty of God extends over all realms of life, Islam must apply to all areas of life: politics, economics, family life, and so on. The terms that scholars use to capture this view include Islamic revivalism, the Islamic resurgence, Islamism, and political Islam. Within this category of Islamic revivalism are many groups with differing agendas, goals, and methods. One can't generalize about them, except to say that they all want a greater role for Islam in private and public life. They range from groups committed to peaceful change and democracy to militant organizations that advocate the violent overthrow of any government that isn't truly Islamic in their eyes. The most important and influential revivalist organization is the Society of Muslim Brothers, better known as the Muslim Brotherhood. Formed in 1928, its motto, and this could be the motto of Islamic revivalism in general, is Islam is the answer. The Brotherhood was founded by Hassan al-Banna, who was angered by British economic and military domination in Egypt. Branches of the Muslim Brotherhood are found throughout the Muslim world, and their goal is to establish an Islamic society through popular action. Most members and branches are committed to doing this peacefully through social organizations, the press, and where they can, participating in elections, although some offshoots of the group have advocated and carried out violent action. In late 2011, in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party won 37% of the votes in the first round of elections for parliament, the highest total of all the parties. Other more conservative and puritanical groups, known as Salafis, are also vying for the religious vote in Egypt. One of the groups that has its origins in the Muslim Brotherhood is Hamas, the Palestinian Islamist group that currently governs the Gaza Strip. Founded in 1987, Hamas, which is an acronym for the Arabic term for Islamic Resistance Movement, brought Islamism into the movement for Palestinian statehood. Whereas the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, and its affiliated political party, Fatah, is largely secular, Hamas wants the Palestinian state to be an Islamic one. I want to conclude by talking about a side of Islam that most Westerners never see, what's often called liberal Islam or progressive Islam. There are many voices in this movement, and they can be found throughout the world. Progressive Islam is a diverse movement, but it tends to feature a number of prominent themes, which include the following: the promotion of democracy, human rights, and individual liberties. The notion that individuals should be free to interpret the Quran in accordance with their reason and conscience. The equality of men and women. Pluralism and a commitment to interfaith dialogue. And commitment to nonviolence wherever possible. There's no doubt that Islam is now an American religion. In fact, Islam is one of America's fastest growing religions. This isn't simply due to immigration. Americans have been converting to Islam at the rate of around 20,000 per year in recent years. However, nobody knows how many Muslims live in America, and the estimates vary dramatically. Since the census does not ask any questions about religion, we have to rely on private polling organizations to estimate how many American Muslims there are. The lowest estimates are around 3 million, and the highest are around 7 million. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. What we know is that Muslims have been in America for centuries, and that American Muslims are a very diverse group coming from every part of the Muslim world. While there are many Muslims who live in the big cities on the west and east coasts, some of the oldest and most well-established Muslim communities are in the Midwest, in cities such as Dearborn, Michigan, and Cedar Rapids, Iowa. In the Twin Cities mosques at which I've spent time, I've met Somalis, Pakistanis, Egyptians, Moroccans, African Americans, and many others. There's a wide range of levels of observance among American Muslims. Nearly 70% say that religion is important in their lives, but some are non-observant secular Muslims who do not adhere to most of the beliefs and practices of the tradition. Less than half of American Muslims pray 5 times daily, although nearly 2/3 pray at least once a day. 8% never pray. Generally speaking, American Muslims are better integrated into American society than Muslims in many European countries, like France or England, are into their societies. In these countries, Muslims often live in poor immigrant neighborhoods, struggling with unemployment or low-paying jobs. Many European Muslims feel alienated from mainstream society, and the resentments have boiled over into demonstrations and violence at times. In America, on the other hand, many Muslims belong to a well-integrated middle class. Surveys show that over 60% of American Muslims have a bachelor degree or higher. 44% are in managerial, professional, technical, or medical fields, and 66% earn over $50,000 annually. One of the major conclusions of a number of recent surveys is that most American Muslims have positive feelings toward America and want to engage fully in American civic life. At the same time, many Muslims feel that despite the fact that they consider themselves faithful Muslims and loyal Americans, non-Muslim Americans don't fully accept them and often portray them unfairly. In a 2011 poll, around 50% of American Muslims reported that they personally experienced discrimination in the past year. And in an earlier poll, 44% of non-Muslim Americans favored restrictions on the civil liberties of American Muslims. One study concluded that Muslims display, quote, an eagerness to fully participate in American public life, tempered by the fear of discrimination and negative portrayals. American Muslims face many challenges. There's been opposition to the building of mosques in neighborhoods in different parts of the country. Muslims in America are surrounded by a culture that features prominent displays of open sexuality and alcohol consumption. Muslims in America have to navigate difficult workplace issues, including the challenge of finding the time and space in the workplace for daily prayers, getting to the mosque on Friday afternoon, and the problem of Muslim women who want the right to wear a hijab, the head covering, at work. In late 2011, the reality show All American Muslims premiered. The show centers on Arab American Muslim families in Dearborn, Michigan, and it features ordinary American Muslims with diverse levels of religious commitment and worldviews. Remarkably, the very attempt to portray Muslims as American citizens like any other has caused some groups to protest the show on the grounds that it fails to show the threat Islam poses to America. Their campaign to pressure advertisers to withdraw from the show has led to a strong reaction from many Muslim American groups and their allies, who see such efforts as motivated by nothing more than a profound misunderstanding about what American Muslims are really like. One of the most fascinating stories in American Islam is that of African American Muslims. Between 25 and 30% of all American Muslims are African American, and the connection of Muslims goes back a long way with Africa. And scholars estimate that up to 20% of African slaves brought to America were Muslim. It's difficult to know the number with any certainty because Christianity was forced upon them, so Muslims had to practice in secret. But the historical record does contain evidence that some slaves would not eat pork and prayed to Allah. Many African American Muslims are drawn to Islam because there's a sense that they're returning to a tradition that was taken from them. Islam has a deep historical connection with Africa. There were Muslims in Africa just years after Muhammad's prophetic career began. African American converts often relinquish their given names, which are considered names forced upon their ancestors by slave owners, and embrace Muslim names. Think of Cassius Clay becoming Muhammad Ali, or Lou Alcindor becoming Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. The organization that's responsible for bringing many African Americans into Islam, especially during the 1950s through 70s, is the Nation of Islam. The Nation began when a mysterious man named Wallace D. Fard began to preach in the black community in Detroit in 1930. Although his ministry only lasted for 4 years, his impact was great. He preached a philosophy of self-help, self-determination, empowerment, and pride, all based on a connection to Islam, to the black community. His most important follower was the man who would take over leadership of the organization, shape its beliefs, and attract hundreds of thousands of followers, Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad taught that W.D. Fard was a manifestation of Allah and thus divine. Elijah Muhammad himself claimed to be a prophet and taught that blacks, but not whites, were creations of God. Elijah Muhammad also advocated racial separatism. The Nation of Islam was literally seen as a separate nation, and its members would have no obligation to the United States, which is one reason that many, including Muhammad Ali, refused the draft. Intermarriage was forbidden, and blacks were told to support only black businesses. Elijah Muhammad's most famous follower was Malcolm X, who would rise to become the public face of the Nation of Islam with his charisma and powerful speaking skills. Malcolm X was drawn to the Nation of Islam while in prison. And in recent decades, many inmates have been drawn to Islam, and Muslim prayer groups can be found at most major prisons. From the study that we've done of Islam, you can probably see that all the ways that the Nation of Islam ideology departed from mainstream Islam. The idea that W.D. Fard was divine is an example of shirk, treating a human being like God. The notion that Elijah Muhammad was a prophet clearly violated the teaching that Muhammad was the seal of the prophets, after whom there would be no more. And the entire idea of racial separatism, and that blacks were creations of God but whites were not, went against the teachings that God created all human beings and that all were equal before God. Elijah Muhammad's son, Warith Din Muhammad, saw these inconsistencies when he studied Islam. Both he and Malcolm X ultimately repudiated the racist teachings of the Nation of Islam and brought most African American Muslims to mainstream Sunni Islam. For Malcolm X, going on the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, and seeing the diversity within Islam was a major factor in his rejection of racist teachings. At this point, there was a split, one that continues to this day. The vast majority of African American Muslims ultimately followed Warith Din Muhammad into his new organization, which became known as the American Society of Muslims. And Warith Din Muhammad became one of the best-known leaders of the American Muslim community, saying the opening prayer before Congress and participating in President Bill Clinton's inauguration. He died in 2008. The Nation of Islam continued under Louis Farrakhan, who maintained Elijah Muhammad's original ideology. And in recent years, he softened some of his rhetoric and established more positive relations with mainstream Muslims. With the knowledge that you've gained from these last 3 lectures, and hopefully the additional learning you'll do in the future, you can correct the misconceptions that you encounter and promote greater understanding. You'll know that whenever you hear a generalization about all Muslims believe, you'll be able to say, well, actually, now that you know so much of the story behind what the media normally portrays, I hope that you have a greater appreciation for how diverse, complex, and fascinating Islam actually is.